Hip-hop is a billion-dollar juggernaut. It is the global language of fashion, politics, and power. It owns the charts, dominates the Super Bowl, and dictates the pulse of modern culture. But if you think this empire was built by corporate suits in glass towers, or solely by the young men in the Bronx who pioneered the breakbeat, you've been told the wrong story. Before the world heard its first scratch, its first rhyme on a vinyl groove, or its first platinum rap record, there was a woman standing in the shadows of an industry built to silence her. Her name was Sylvia Robinson, and in the summer of 1979, she was the most dangerous woman in music, not because she had money, but because she had nothing left to lose. Imagine a New York City that is literally burning. The Bronx is a graveyard of torched tenements. Disco, the multi-million-dollar heart of the 70 seconds, is imploding in a violent wave of cultural backlash. The major labels are panicking, looking for the next big thing in their penthouse offices, completely blind to the revolution brewing in the streets. Now, look at Sylvia. She's 43 years old. In an industry that treats women like disposable commodities, she is considered a ghost, a has-been. Her legendary label, All Platinum, is a crumbling fortress. The IRS is at her door, the bank is circling her home like a shark, and her reputation is bleeding out in a sea of lawsuits and tax debt. She isn't just broke, she is 1 month away from total erasure. But one humid Friday night, at a cramped Harlem club called Harlem World, the trajectory of human history changed. Sylvia didn't go there to find a miracle. She went there to escape the crushing weight of her own failure. But as she stepped into the sweat-soaked darkness, she didn't hear a song. She heard a pulse. She heard a DJ looping a bass line from a chic record, and over that beat, young men were doing the impossible. They were speaking in rhythm. They were turning their struggle into poetry, their frustration into energy, and their invisibility into a roar. To the white executives in Midtown, this was ghetto noise. To the purists, it was a fad that wouldn't last the summer. But Sylvia Robinson, standing in the back of that room with the tax man breathing down her neck, heard the sound of the next 50 years. She knew she had exactly one bullet left in the chamber of her career. If she bet her final shred of dignity on this street talk and failed, she would die a footnote in musical history. But if she was right, she wouldn't just save her empire. She would give a voice to a generation the world had tried to bury. Welcome to the Underrated Insider. Today, we go beyond the glitz of the charts to uncover the clandestine mother of a culture. This is the story of Sylvia Robinson, the visionary who recognized hip-hop's value when it was still just noise, the strategist who outmaneuvered the mafia, and the woman who gambled her soul to make the world listen. To understand how Sylvia Robinson could spot the future of music in a crowded Harlem basement in 1979, you have to go back to where it all began, the pavement of 1932nd Harlem. Sylvia Vanderpool was born on the 29th of May, 1935, into a world where music wasn't just a pastime, it was the very fabric of survival. Her parents were immigrants from the Virgin Islands, carrying with them a fierce work ethic and the quiet dignity of those who had traveled far for a better life. Her father labored at General Motors, a rare, stable job for a black man at the time, while her mother ran the household with a combination of religious discipline and unyielding faith. Harlem, in the 1940 seconds, was a sensory overload of sound. It was the tail end of the Renaissance, where the echoes of jazz legends still vibrated through the brownstones, and every street corner was a stage for doo-wop groups harmonizing under the glow of flickering streetlights. Sylvia didn't just grow up in this environment. She absorbed it. She possessed a vocal depth that defied her age, a softness that could cut through the noise of a bustling city, and a poise that made adults stop in their tracks. By the age of 13, the industry came calling. Columbia Records, one of the giants of the era, saw a product they could sell. They rebranded her as Little Sylvia, and in 1951, she was ushered into a recording studio to cut Little Boy, alongside the legendary trumpeter Hot Lips Page. In the grainy archival photos of that session, you see a girl with pigtails standing in a room full of grown men, thick with cigarette smoke and the cold machinery of commerce. She was a child entering a shark tank. The 950 Seconds music industry was a predatory labyrinth for black artists, particularly for young women. Labels like Savoy and Jubilee saw talent as a renewable resource to be mined, used, and discarded. Sylvia quickly learned a devastating lesson. In the eyes of the executives, she was a voice on a disc, not a person with a future. She watched her peers, men and women with voices like angels, climb to the top of the charts, only to end up back on the streets, penniless, because they didn't understand the fine print of the contracts they had signed with trembling, excited hands. These were the early scars that would never quite heal. They forged in her a profound, almost obsessive need for autonomy. Sylvia realized that the person at the microphone was the most vulnerable person in the room. The real power sat behind the glass, in the producer's chair, holding the pen that wrote the checks and the copyright forms. Her parents, perhaps sensing the volatility of her singing career, insisted she learn an instrument. They wanted her to have a trade. She chose the guitar. Her teacher was Mickey Baker, a man who played with a sharp, aggressive precision. But Sylvia didn't just want to learn chords. She wanted to learn the architecture of a hit. The guitar became her second language, a tool that allowed her to communicate with musicians on their own terms. She was no longer just a girl singer waiting for instructions. She was beginning to understand how to build a song from the ground up. By the time she reached her late teens, Sylvia Vanderpool had already lived a full career's worth of exploitation. She had been Little Sylvia, the puppet of major labels. But as she moved into the mid-50 seconds, the puppet strings were fraying. She was growing tired of singing songs written by people who didn't know her life, for companies that didn't value her soul. She was ready to stop being the voice and start being the architect. And her first major move would not only change her life, but it would create a melody that would haunt the American subconscious for the next 70 years. By the mid-1950 seconds, Sylvia Vanderpool was no longer a child. She was a seasoned veteran of the recording booth, possessing a sharp intuition for what moved the needle. But she was still a satellite orbiting other people's suns. That changed when she solidified her partnership with her guitar teacher, Mickey Baker. Together, they became Mickey and Sylvia, a duo that would redefine the sound of the era. In 1956, they released a track that would become an indelible part of the American songbook, Love is Strange. Built on a hypnotic, calypso-flavored guitar riff and a playful, conversational vocal exchange, the song was unlike anything on the radio. It wasn't just a hit, it was a phenomenon. It climbed to #1 on the R&B charts and broke into the top 20 of the Billboard Hot 100. It sold over 1 million copies at a time when black artists rarely saw that kind of crossover success. But behind the catchy Sylvia, yes, Mickey, banter was a cold, hard reality. Despite the massive sales and the fame, the duo was still trapped in a system designed to extract maximum value for minimum payout. Sylvia was the one who had helped shape the arrangement. She was the one whose magnetic presence anchored the duo. Yet, as the checks were cut and the royalties were calculated, she realized that being a star was a trap if you didn't own the sky. This was the moment the dream of independence was born. Sylvia began to pull away from the spotlight. While Mickey Baker was a purist who loved the instrument, Sylvia was becoming a strategist who loved the industry. She didn't just want to be the face on the record, she wanted to be the name on the building. She began experimenting with songwriting for other artists and dipping her toes into the technical side of production, a territory that was almost exclusively white and male. Her personal life soon mirrored her professional ambition. On a cruise ship floating along the Hudson River, Sylvia met Joe Robinson. Joe wasn't a musician. He was a Navy veteran and a quintessential Harlem hustler. He had the grit and the street-smart business acumen that Sylvia's creative genius needed. He saw in Sylvia not just a talented wife, but a powerhouse business partner. In a move that was decades ahead of its time, they decided to stop asking for a seat at the table and decided to build their own house. They left the chaos of New York City and moved across the river to Englewood, New Jersey. In 1968, they founded All Platinum Records. Establishing an independent, black-owned label in the late 60 seconds was an act of quiet revolution. It was a time when the big three labels held a stranglehold on distribution and radio play. To survive, The Robinsons had to be twice as fast and 10 times as smart. They built their own recording studio, Soul Sound, right in New Jersey. Sylvia became the primary producer, the head of A&R, and the chief songwriter. She was a woman in a glass booth, calling the shots in an era where women were barely allowed to manage their own bank accounts. She wasn't just producing music, she was producing a legacy of self-reliance. All Platinum became the laboratory where Sylvia refined her ear. She learned how to manufacture soul, how to polish a rough vocal, and how to create a sound that belonged to her label and her label alone. By the early 70 seconds, All Platinum began to hum with success. Hits like Love on a Two-Way Street by The Moments proved that Sylvia's instincts were world-class. She was no longer Little Sylvia the puppet. She was Sylvia Robinson, the architect of a rising empire. However, the higher they climbed, the more they realized that the music business wasn't just about melodies. Nurturing a hit often meant dancing with some of the most dangerous players in the game. By the early 1970 seconds, Sylvia Robinson had achieved something nearly impossible for a black woman in America. She owned the masters, she owned the studio, and she owned the airwaves. While the industry was still grappling with the civil rights movement's aftermath, Sylvia was busy building a sonic fortress in Englewood, New Jersey. She wasn't just a label owner in name, she was a hands-on auteur. She was known to stay in the studio for 18 hours straight, obsessing over the reverb on a snare drum or the placement of a backing vocal. She had developed the all-platinum sound, a sophisticated, lush, yet gritty version of East Coast soul that stood as a direct rival to the polished hits coming out of Motown. In 1970, she proved her genius by writing and producing Love on a Two-Way Street for The Moments. It was a masterclass in atmospheric soul, reaching #1 on the R&B charts and staying there for 5 weeks. But Sylvia's most defiant and defining moment as a producer was yet to come. It was a moment born out of a rejection. In 1972, Sylvia wrote a song that was pulsating with a new kind of energy, breathies, sensual, and unapologetically intimate. She originally intended the track for the legendary Al Green. She flew to Memphis to pitch it to him, believing his silky voice was the perfect vehicle for the lyrics. But Green, who was deeply conflicted between his secular stardom and his religious calling, turned it down. He told her it was too suggestive, too carnal for his image. Most producers would have shopped the song to another male star or buried it in a drawer. Not Sylvia. She returned to New Jersey, walked into her own studio, and decided to reclaim her voice. She stepped behind the microphone for the first time in years and recorded Pillow Talk. Pillow Talk was a cultural lightning bolt. Released in 1973, the song featured Sylvia's hushed, orgasmic moans, whispered provocations, and a seductive bass line that felt like a heartbeat. It was one of the first explicitly sex-positive records ever released by a black woman. In an era where female sexuality was often policed or filtered through a male perspective, Sylvia was the one in control. She wasn't just singing about desire, she was producing it. The song exploded. It hit #1 on the soul charts and #3 on the Billboard Hot 100. It earned her a Grammy nomination and solidified her status as the Queen of Sensual Soul. But more importantly, it provided the capital for the Robinsons to make their boldest business move yet. In 1975, they purchased the legendary Chess Records catalog. Chess was the home of Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, and Bo Diddley, the very foundations of rock and roll. For a black-owned independent label to acquire such a prestigious library was a seismic shift in power. Sylvia was no longer just a hitmaker. She was a gatekeeper of American musical history. However, the view from the top was precarious. As the mid-70 seconds gave way to the late 70 seconds, the musical landscape began to shift violently. The raw soul of all platinum was being pushed aside by the mechanical, high-gloss juggernaut of disco. Major labels were pouring millions into strobe lights and four-on-the-floor beats, squeezing out independent players. The Robinsons tried to keep pace. They launched sub-labels like Turbo, Vibration, and Stang. They signed more acts, cut more records, and lived a life of flamboyant luxury fueled by a constant stream of hits. But the overhead was astronomical. Joe's aggressive business tactics and the rising costs of maintaining an independent empire began to take a toll. By 1978, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. All Platinum was hemorrhaging money. Distribution deals were soured by predatory practices, and the IRS began circling their mansion like a bird of prey. The Chess Records acquisition, once a crown jewel, had become a financial weight. They were fighting lawsuits on multiple fronts, from artists demanding unpaid royalties to creditors demanding their pound of flesh. Sylvia, the woman who had survived the bop era, the doo-wop era, and the soul era, found herself staring at the end of the road. Her studio was quiet. Her bank accounts were frozen. The all-platinum luster had faded into a dull gray. It was in this state of absolute desperation, with her back against the wall and her legacy on the line, that she would find herself in Harlem World on that fateful night in 1979. She didn't know it yet, but the queen of sensual soul was about to be reborn as the mother of hip-hop. But this rebirth would come with a price that would haunt her family for decades. By the summer of 1979, the glitter of the all-platinum era had turned to dust. Sylvia and Joe Robinson were living in a beautiful mansion in Englewood, but it was a house of cards. The electricity was being cut off, the phone lines were dead, and the IRS was preparing to seize their assets. Sylvia, a woman who had spent 30 years building her name, was staring at the very real possibility of losing everything. She was looking for a miracle, and as history often proves, miracles usually appear in the places where no one else is looking. On a humid June night, Sylvia's son, Joey Robinson Jr., persuaded her to attend a birthday party at Harlem World, a legendary club at 116th Street and Lenox Avenue. Sylvia arrived tired, her mind heavy with debt and legal battles. She expected the usual a DJ playing the latest disco hits to a crowd trying to dance away their troubles. But the moment she stepped inside, the atmosphere felt different. It was primal. It was electric. It was raw. The DJ wasn't just playing records, he was manipulating them. He was cutting and scratching, extending the drum breaks of Chic's Good Times into an infinite loop. And then there was the voice. A young man with a microphone was talking over the beat. He wasn't singing a melody. He was commanding the room with a rhythmic, percussive flow that hit like a heartbeat. He told stories about the neighborhood, he boasted about his style, and he engaged the crowd in a call and response that turned the entire club into a single, breathing organism. Sylvia stood near the back, frozen. To the major label executives in Midtown Manhattan, this was street noise, a temporary distraction for kids who couldn't afford instruments. But Sylvia, with her producer's ears and her veteran's instinct, heard something else. She heard the soul of the future. She recognized that this wasn't just a performance, it was a movement. She saw that the energy of the streets was finally ready to be captured on wax. She turned to her son and said, "Joey, if I can put that on a record, it will save us. It will be the biggest thing in the world." But there was a massive obstacle. The pioneers of this new art form, the real street MCs of the Bronx and Harlem, like Grandmaster Flash and Lovebug Starsky, were purists. They believed that rapping was a live experience, a sacred ritual of the park jams and basement parties. They didn't want it recorded. They didn't trust the industry, and they certainly didn't trust a disco lady from New Jersey. Sylvia, however, was never a woman to take no for an answer. She decided that if the stars of the streets wouldn't come to her, she would create her own stars. A few days later, while driving through Englewood in her Buick, her son Joey pointed out a young man named Henry Big Bank Hank Jackson. Hank wasn't a professional rapper. He was a bouncer at a local club and worked at a pizza shop. But he had a booming voice and a collection of rhymes he had borrowed from a real Bronx MC named Grandmaster Kaz. Sylvia stopped the car, told Hank to get in, and had him rap for her right there in the front seat. Next, she found Michael Wonder Mike Wright, a young man with a smooth, sophisticated flow, and Guy Master Guy O'Brien, the youngest of the bunch with a high-energy charisma. These three young men had never performed together. They weren't a group. They were a construction of Sylvia's imagination. She brought them into a rehearsal space and told them they were now the Sugar Hill Gang, named after the affluent section of Harlem that represented the pinnacle of black achievement. In late summer of 1979, she brought them into the studio. The session was chaotic. The house band, led by bassist Chip Sheeran, was told to play the Good Times bass line for 15 minutes straight without stopping. The rappers, nervous and inexperienced, took turns at the mic. There were no retakes, no digital editing, no safety net. Sylvia stood behind the glass, directing them like an orchestral conductor, pushing them to keep the energy high, to keep the vibe alive. What emerged from that session was a 15-minute track called Rapper's Delight. When it was finished, the engineers laughed. The distributors told her it was too long for radio. The critics said it was a joke. But Sylvia Robinson didn't care. She took the last of her money, pressed the records, and sent them out into the world. Within weeks, the joke turned into a revolution. The street noise was about to become the loudest sound on the planet, and Sylvia Robinson was the one holding the volume knob. When the 15-minute master tape of Rapper's Delight was finished, the music industry looked at Sylvia Robinson as if she had lost her mind. In 1979, the golden rule of radio was 3 minutes. Anything longer was considered commercial suicide. Furthermore, the idea of a record with no singing, just rhythmic talking, was seen as a gimmick that would vanish within a month. Even the pioneers in the Bronx were furious, accusing Sylvia of stealing a live culture and packaging it into a plastic product for profit. But Sylvia had a secret weapon that the major labels lacked. She knew the streets better than they knew their own boardrooms. She didn't wait for the approval of the gatekeepers in New York. She bypassed the giant radio stations and sent the record to small, independent DJs in the South and the Midwest. The breakthrough happened in an unlikely place. Street. Louis. A DJ began playing the record as a joke, but the phone lines at the station immediately lit up. People weren't just curious, they were obsessed. They wanted to hear it again and again. The demand was so overwhelming that the station had to put the 15-minute version on a loop. From Street. Louis. The fire spread to Detroit, then Chicago, and finally, it circled back to New York like a tidal wave that could no longer be ignored. Released in September 1979 on the newly formed Sugar Hill Records, named after the prestigious Harlem neighborhood, Rapper's Delight did the unthinkable. It broke into the Billboard Top 40, peaking at number 36. It hit number 4 on the R&B charts, but its real power was felt internationally. It went to number 1 in Canada, the Netherlands, and South Africa. It hit the top 5 in the UK. For the first time in history, a rap record was being played in discos in Paris, clubs in London, and street corners in Tokyo. Sylvia Robinson had taken a hyper-local New York subculture and turned it into a global dialect. The financial impact was instantaneous and staggering. The worthless gimmick began selling 50,000 copies a day. The taxman retreated, the bank stopped its foreclosure, and the Robinson mansion was suddenly filled with the sound of champagne corks popping instead of creditors knocking. Sugar Hill Records became the hottest label in America. Sylvia had not only saved her home, she had built a new empire on the ruins of the old one. But Rapper's Delight was more than just a financial windfall. It was a cultural crowbar. It forced the doors of the music industry open for an entire generation of black artists who had been told their voices were too raw for the mainstream. It proved that there was a massive, untapped market for the stories of the inner city. However, as the money poured in by the millions, the cracks began to reappear. The success of the Sugar Hill Gang brought fame to 3 young men who weren't prepared for it, and it brought scrutiny to a business model that was built on street rules rather than corporate transparency. Sylvia had delivered hip-hop to the world, but the world was about to find out that the mother of hip-hop ran her house with an iron fist. The honeymoon period was short, and the shadows of the industry lawsuits, unpaid royalties, and the arrival of a dangerous new partner were about to turn the Sugar Hill dream into a legal and personal nightmare. Success in the music industry has always had a shadow, but for Sugar Hill Records, that shadow was cast by a man whose name was whispered in fear across Manhattan, Morris Levy. As Rapper's Delight climbed the charts and millions of dollars flooded into the Robinsons' accounts, The logistical weight of running a global empire became too much for their independent infrastructure. They needed muscle, they needed distribution, and they needed capital. Joe Robinson, ever the street-smart hustler, reached out to Levy, the owner of Roulette Records and a notorious associate of the Genovese crime family. Sylvia reportedly feared Levy from the moment he walked into their lives. She famously called him the devil, a man who didn't care about the music, only the math of exploitation. But Joe saw the partnership as a necessary evil. Levy brought the power to ensure Sugar Hill Records were in every store and that radio stations played their tracks, but that power came with blood-stained ink. The deal with Levy transformed Sugar Hill from a family business into a high-stakes battlefield. As the label signed new icons like Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, the Sugar Hill way of doing business began to trigger alarms. Sylvia and Joe ran the label like a feudal estate. They often listed themselves as songwriters and publishers on tracks they hadn't written, a common industry practice that stripped young, naive artists of their long-term wealth. Contracts were signed in haste, often without lawyers present, and the accounting was famously opaque. The tension reached a breaking point with Grandmaster Flash. As the visionary behind The Message, the song that proved hip-hop could be a tool for social commentary, Flash realized that while he was changing the world, he wasn't seeing the wealth his art generated. After a tip-off from funk legend Rick James about how publishing royalties actually worked, Flash confronted the Robinsons. The fallout was nuclear. Flash sued Sugar Hill for $5 million in unpaid royalties, a move that sent shockwaves through the culture. He wasn't just suing a label, he was suing the mother of hip-hop. One by one, other artists followed suit. The Sequence, the Funky 4+1, and the Treacherous 3 all began to voice the same grievance. They were being celebrated by the world but exploited by the very woman who had given them a platform. The legal battles began to drain the label's resources and Sylvia's spirit. The pressure of the lawsuits, combined with the looming presence of the mob and Joe's increasingly volatile business tactics, began to erode the Robinsons' marriage. Sylvia found herself trapped in a prison of her own making, a mogul who had defied the system only to become part of a new, more dangerous one. The woman who had fought so hard to be heard was now being accused of silencing the very voices she had helped amplify. The empire was still standing, but the foundation was rotting, and the fire was coming. By the mid-1980 seconds, the world Sylvia Robinson had built was moving faster than she could track. New labels like Def Jam were emerging with a rawer, street-level energy, and the Sugar Hill sound began to feel like a relic of a simpler time. The lawsuits from artists like Grandmaster Flash had not only drained the treasury but had also tarnished the label's prestige. The industry that Sylvia had forced to listen was now looking past her, toward a new generation of moguls who didn't owe her anything. The 1,990 seconds were a long, slow fading for the Robinson empire. The hits dried up, and the business became a grueling cycle of litigation and debt management. In 2000, the partnership that had anchored Sylvia's life for 4 decades came to an end when Joe Robinson passed away from cancer. Without Joe's aggressive business maneuvers, Sylvia was left alone to manage the weight of a crumbling legacy and a catalog that was constantly being contested in court. But the final devastating blow came on a cold night in 2002. A massive fire tore through the Sugar Hill studio and offices in Englewood, New Jersey. Dozens of firefighters battled the blaze for hours, but the destruction was near total. This wasn't just a loss of property, it was a loss of history. 90% of the label's master tapes, the original, physical recordings of Rapper's Delight, The Message, and countless soul hits from the all-platinum era were reduced to ash and smoke. Rumors swirled about the cause of the fire, some whispered of negligence, others of insurance desperation, and some saw it as a dark, poetic end to a turbulent era. For Sylvia, it was a heartbreak from which there was no recovery. The physical evidence of her genius, the magnetic tape that captured the birth of a global culture, was gone. The empire had not fallen to a rival or a bank. It had vanished into the New Jersey sky. Sylvia Robinson was no longer a mogul in a glass booth. She was a guardian of ghosts, left with only the echoes of a sound that had once changed the world. Sylvia Robinson passed away on the 29th of September 2011, at the age of 75. She died in a world that looked nothing like the one she had entered in 1935. By the time of her death, hip-hop was no longer a street fad or a ghetto noise. It was the most dominant cultural force on the planet. It was a multi-billion-dollar industry that dictated the rhythm of global fashion, language, and politics. But as the world celebrated the 30th and 40th anniversaries of the culture, Sylvia's name was often relegated to a footnote, buried under the weight of the controversies she had left behind. Her legacy remains one of the most complicated chapters in American music history. To some, she was a predatory figure, a woman who used the street rules of a bygone era to exploit young artists and strip them of their rightful earnings. To others, she was a visionary savior, the only person with the courage and the ear to bet her life on a sound that the rest of the world had dismissed as trash. The truth, as it often does, sits in the uncomfortable middle. Sylvia Robinson was not a saint, she was a mogul. She was a black woman who had been hardened by an industry that tried to crush her since she was 13 years old. She learned early on that in the music business, you are either the hammer or the nail. She chose to be the hammer. In 2022, the world finally began to offer the recognition she had been denied for decades. Sylvia Robinson was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, receiving the Ahmet Ertegun Award. It was a public acknowledgement that the fingerprints of this woman from Harlem are on every rap record ever made. Without her intervention in 1979, hip-hop might have remained a local New York secret for another decade. Without her, the bridge between the park jams of the Bronx and the global charts might never have been built. Sylvia Robinson didn't invent hip-hop, but she recognized its value when it was invisible to everyone else. She saw poetry where others saw chaos. She saw profit, yes, but she also saw purpose. She proved that the voices of the marginalized could command the attention of the world. Today, every time you hear a rap verse on the radio or see a hip-hop artist headlining a stadium, a part of Sylvia's work is alive. Her life is a masterclass in the messy, beautiful, and often brutal reality of cultural innovation. She was a singer, a guitarist, a songwriter, a producer, and a CEO. But above all, she was the architect of the unthinkable. To the dreamers, the hustlers, and the outsiders who have been told their ideas are too raw for the world, Sylvia Robinson's life stands as a testament. Progress is never clean, and change is never comfortable. But sometimes, all it takes is one person with their back against the wall and their ears tuned to the future to change the world forever. Sylvia Robinson heard the heartbeat of a new America before America even knew it was changing. And because of her, the world hasn't stopped dancing since.